Welcome and greetings to New Earth Restoration online Shabbat service for July 20th, 2024. This is the fifth month, second day of our feast calendar. I'm so glad to see you here today. This has been a real week of thinking for me, and I have a meditation for you that is probably the most poignant piece of literature in all the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's from the community rule or the Yahad rule. It's slightly lengthy, but I think you'll enjoy it once we get started. It requires a special voice to even speak it because it's beautiful, it's emotionally deep. And if we had time, we'd just go on with this the whole service because I think that it would be meaningful to everybody here. So let me get started with it. Meditation. Perhaps the most striking text of all in the community rule and the scrolls. This is for the teacher of righteousness. The teacher will bless Elohim at the times ordained of Elohim with prayer. When the daylight begins its dominion, each time it returns, and when, as ordained, it's regathered into its dwelling, when night begins its watches, as he opens his storehouse and spreads darkness over the earth, and when it cycles back, withdrawing before the light, when the luminaries show forth from their sacred space, and when they are regathered into their lofty place, when the times appointed for new months arrive, and when, as their seasons require, each gives way to the next, such renewal is special for the Kodash Kodashim, the people of the Holy of Holies. Indeed, it's a sign that he's unlocking enduring loving kindness each time these cycles renew as ordained. And so it will be for every age yet to come. On the first month in its season, and on high days laid down as remembrances in their seasons, I will bless him in prayer. As a written rule forever, yea, when each new year begins, and when its seasons turn, fulfilling the Torah in their decree, each day as set forth, day after day, harvest giving way to summer, planting to the shoots of spring, seasons, years, and weeks of years. When weeks of years begin, Jubilee by Jubilee, while I live, the commandment will be inscribed on my tongue, with praise as its fruit, the gift of my lips. I will loudly and skillfully sing my music for the esteem of Elohim only. My harp and my lyre, I touch the strings for his sanctity. I will lift up the flute of my lips, with his Torah its tuning fork. At break of day, and with the darkening of the sky, I will enter the covenant of Elohim, and when they all leave, I will recite his ordinances. Then I will set out the bounds of my path, never to turn back. By his Torah, I will convict myself, my iniquity the measure, my sin as a statute engraved before my eyes. To Elohim I will say, oh, my righteousness, all to El Elyon. Oh, you seat of my goodness, spring of Da'at, knowledge, and fount of Kodeshah, holiness. Kavod Hagadol, greatly esteemed. El Shaddai, Shekinah Laolam, the radiance of the ages. What he teaches me, that will I choose. As he judges me, so will I delight. When first I begin my plan or journey, I will bless his name. When first I set out or turn to come back, when I sit down or rise up, when I spread my bed, then I will rejoice in him. I'll bless him with the offering, the issue of my lips, when in the ranks, before I lift hand to mouth, to taste the ground's pleasant bounty. When fear or terror break out, in the places of dire straits or desolation, I will praise him. I will meditate on his miracles and powerful acts. I will contemplate his loving kindness, upon which I rely all day long. Then will I know that the judgment of all the living resides in his hand, and all his works are truth. When I break out in depression, I will praise him, and in his salvation will I rejoice. To no one will I return evil for evil. I will go after a person only for good. For with Elohim resides the judgment of all the living, and he'll compensate each one. My zeal will not be tarnished by a mean spirit, and I will not lust for riches gained through violence. I will not take custody of the evil multitude until the day of vengeance, yet my fury will never subside from those of the pit, and I will never be satisfied until righteousness will be established. I will not harbor a grudge of wrath against anyone repenting of sin. Yet I will neither love anyone who rebels against the way. I will not comfort those smitten with sin until their walk is perfected. I will give no refuge in my heart to Belial. Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. So if you've got a presentation already, it would be great if you could come on. I think we've got the Hoffmans on here in a week or two. I'm really looking forward to that. Yes, I am. Yes, I am. So anyway, today you got me again, and I think you're going to have to get used to it because I may be doing a lot from now on. I want to talk about the Yahad. And I want to point you scripturally in the directions of Acts chapter 1 at the end, which I'm not going to read because it's so familiar. You already know it. I will just remind you that this is where the apostles get together, and they're with the 120, as you recall, and they need to fill a position. And what do? It's interesting to me that they just take nominations, and then they get 2 nominations, and then okay, and then and then they have a democratic vote. The members vote for who they're going to want to have, and that is the text today. Remember, there was Matthias or Matidyahu and Joseph Barsabas Eustace, Joseph Zadik. So here's 2 guys, one with one plain priestly name and the other one with 3 big names. Maybe by the time we get done here, I'll let you know what those names mean. So we're going to start with the historical prevalence of the interests at the Yahad, classical Yahad, what we've been doing for, well, nearly 25 years now. When we started this ministry, the people gathered from nowhere. They did. I started giving a Bible study in the home. I had just moved into the area. I didn't know anybody, and here they come. And I've got for you a list of the topics once we got together that we were all interested in and learning about from the first. Getting back to the roots of right religion, of course, that is primitive, what they call today, Jewish Christianity, also known as the Nazarene faith or Nazarene Israelites, or the way, the poor, the Hasidim, if you read Maccabees, the Jesus movement, Nazarene Judaism, I see that once in a while, and Messianism outside and before rabbinical or Pharisaical Judaism, both the same, or Gentile Christianity, talking about exclusively the religion of Yeshua, James, Peter, the Apostolic Band, without adding or taking anything away. And the mission, we decided, was to discover the historical and authentic apostolic witnesses, beliefs, practices, spirituality, which led us to some new and at the time rather rare texts. And it seems like to me that so many of the apostolic texts that we have just little bits of, bits and pieces, had been destroyed by the Gentile church or probably the rabbinical Jews. They didn't like this movement from the very first. And why don't we have letters from Yeshua here? Well, we do have one letter from Yeshua to the king of Adiabene, and I think we've talked about that before. But anyway, they're gone, burned in the trash heap. My personal interest in these topics arose through the 1990s. Through that time, I read a number of scholarly accounts of what was known of the earliest Jesus movement. Then I began to read some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I remember the first time I picked up a Dead Sea Scrolls in the 80s before they released the rest. I thought, this is the most boring reading I have ever done. Well, I changed my mind. Reading something with a little more knowledge will change your mind. One of those was the community rule, or the Yahad rule, it's so-called. And that's what I read a little piece of today. These many readings became influential in my life, very influential. And one book in particular, titled James, the Brother of Jesus, by Robert Eisenman, as author, still a friend and member of the Yahad think tank group. Something happened to me that I never, ever thought in my life would. And that thing was that I had the opportunity to go and do a series of lectures with him in, of all places, Oklahoma. That was a high point. That was back in 2016. I loved it. That book, James, the Brother of Jesus, was evidently specially anointed for me to read. It pushed my thought life and religious life in a new and exciting direction. That a lot of historical knowledge about Yahshua and his movements were hidden behind the words of Scripture. That's what it taught me. Behind the words, there's something more to know. And then other ancient books that had recently popped out of the ground someplace came to my attention. And my religious life was changed. Some say it wasn't for the better, but we'll see about that. I was never interested in the writings of later historical Gentiles. I mean, historical additions and subtractions from the Halakha. Speaking of the Apostolic Fathers, anything that would deviate from the primitive teachings of Messiah that we read about primarily in the Gospels. Since most of those guys, if not all, were Catholics, several of them were Jew haters, occasionally in their works excoriating the Jews in their writings as Christ killers. destroying the ordinances of the Father, and even warring against believers who thought a little differently, even about things that could never be proven. I wasn't much interested anymore in church writings. Look, I did that for years. I was a good churchman, and I was a faithful churchman. But so many of those practices were Gnostic and are Gnostic, or didn't coincide with the primitive way. What is Gnosticism? Well, Gnosticism, at its root, there are two gods. One, the high God, has no intercourse with human beings. I mean social intercourse, not the other kind. And the second lower god, Yalda Ba'oth, or Yahweh, who was evil and created everything on earth, and that all things are evil on earth. There's no good to be found. So there's no reason why you can't do whatever you want, because the High Father knows that. He doesn't care anyway. And because you're in that environment, you're expected to understand that if you sin, that's a good thing for your soul, because you are able to see how gracious the Father is through that sin. He doesn't strike you dead when you sin. That doesn't happen. Although sometimes I think your inner heart would want to strike you dead. So I wasn't interested in that stuff anymore. On the other hand, some practices of the church were ours in the first place. Ours, Nazarene Israelites, ours, Ebionites, Enochians, the other words, the way, they were ours. And I thought, and still think, we must take those practices back. Hey, this was ours in the first place. Communion, that was ours in the first place. Passover, not Easter, that was ours in the first place. Come on, let's take them back. Let's take back everything that is rightfully ours and bring them into our movement. So many things. Another prevailing desire that the group and I myself had was to get as close to Jesus, the man, as possible, and approach his kin and friends and disciples authentically, which requires deep research, as the early texts that have been nearly destroyed by enemies, as I mentioned, and being directed through those texts by the Spirit of holiness. And more, correcting biblical deceptions and interpolations. In the early 90s and late 80s, I got very interested in translating the New Testament anew. Right now, I'm still doing it. I'm in the middle of translating the entire book of Revelation. I probably have about a fourth of it done now, and that takes an extraordinary amount of time, especially for one who is a little bit rusty at ancient Greek. So along with those deceptions and interpolations that we want to correct, that is stuff in the Bible that's been put in by other people, not the actual true authors, exposing false teaching. I want to do that. And false prophets. Expose them, don't you? To those who blindly follow the way of sensation and conspiracy, yet doing it in a kindly manner. Let us then reclaim the primitive practices in this new restructured Yahad, realizing that a large movement of people called Essenes, called that by Gentiles, they never call themselves that, came into the synagogues of the Nazarenes, partly due to the publication of the Messiah's testaments, and especially the letter to the Hebrews, the letters of James and Jude, each correcting the Essenes' thinking. Let's reread the essay published by British Israel titled Jesus Was a Qumran Asim, an essay that I have here and that you ought to have just to look through, because this essay forces us to consider the conclusion that Yeshua was of the Hasidic, Essenic, Enochian branch of Judaism, and that is not the Hasidic branch of Aquarianism, but Judaism. The Yahad weekly meetings began to be attended locally. Well, we encouraged one another toward Yahading in the following activities. Let us do networking and friend building through good deeds and sowing seeds to needs, by which our eventual common salvation is made clear, that is, through works. And afterwards, disciple making through projects, presentations, ordinations, formal training, extensive education, listening, a lost art, and the formal practice of right religion. And we did that, and to an extent, we still do that, insofar as we can online. Let us provide venues for new and novice ministers or would-be ministers and speakers in their quest to be better evangelists or to be heard for their new discoveries and research. When I was a young guy trying to preach, I just couldn't get an opportunity. And then I worked on my delivery a little bit, which has degraded since then. And all of a sudden, they begin to come in. Opportunities, one after the other. Sometimes, though not a preacher, not ordained by any organization, I would be preaching 3 times on a Sunday. It was wonderful, but I'm not the kind that can just speak off the top of the head anymore. That took a lot of research and a lot of work. Let the new people then receive constructive criticism from the elders and from the elders only. Let us educate them, teach them to properly speak. You hear me? Teach them to properly speak. Ordain them, evaluate them, and send them forth with the new word, the new covenant of Damascus, the bloody cup. In summary, when the Yahad started out, the intention was to form a physical group that would come together once a week to study and discuss the original Jesus movement, Jesus' brand of Judaism, and the beliefs and practices of the Apostolic Band, and primarily those of James the Just, or Yaakov HaSadiq, Yeshua's brother. We call this Hebraic roots, for the religious forebears of Yeshua and Yaakov go back past the time of the Maccabees. They weren't with the Maccabees because the Maccabees double-crossed them and had a bunch of them murdered. We don't know why, but that is still in our history books. And as far back as Ezekiel, who they say was the first Nazarene or the first Essene, some people do. And if the allies or members of the Zadokite priesthood were, if it's still a foundational priesthood, well, since Yeshua and his brothers Yaakov and Shimon were certainly hereditary priests of that order, if the genealogy of Yeshua is correct, that goes back to 100 to 1000 BC, back to the time of King David, and even further then to Melchizedek and Abraham themselves. That goes back to 1800 BC. That is a long time for the Zadokite movement and priesthood, which is also the priesthood of Melchizedek priesthood, same thing, to be in force And what Ezekiel says is that it will be in force forever. Forever. Well, those Zadokite priests probably weren't Levitical priests. Go back into your Bible and read the history of where Zadok came from, and you'll find not until the last book of the Old Testament, Second Chronicles, I believe, the last one written, where these people, these priests, were connected to the Levites. Scholars tell us that that was added by the Masoretes later, that they were sons of Levi, just so they could cover up the obvious fact in the Torah that they, and in the books of Samuel, that they were not connected with Levi. They were something different. We're something different. The Enochian Zadokite line of priests, they weren't Levites. That's a good thing to think about and check for yourself if you could. These sons of Zadok, as Ezekiel teaches, were to take on the responsibility and authority for all worship and for the temple grounds. Of course, the temple was done in 70 AD, and what came out of that terrible day of Yahweh was that only two branches of Judaism continued to exist. One was the Pharisees, who made a deal with Rome. I think I told you maybe last week or last Sunday night about how the head Pharisee got out of Jerusalem, able to get out, freeing himself in a coffin, made a deal with the Romans and compromised greatly. The second strain or branch of Judaism was the Nazareans or Nazareans. They were able to get by because they kept their mouths shut and they hid out. So they continued to grow and people started coming in. And of course, they were pacifists, at least as far as we know, pacifists, as we see from the time that they went to Pella instead of fighting in that war. So this line precedes the Pharisees, the Rabbinicals, and Sadducean movements by nearly 2,000 years. We're getting in on something that is historical and something that was lost over the years. The Nazarene movement finally ended up being Islam, but that's a whole nother story. After a time, the people involved in Yahad wanted to try out what we'd learned by having a synagogue-style meeting on another day, which turned out to be Erev Shabbat, the Friday evening before the Shabbat. So we did that, and we had Friday night synagogue services based on the ancient practice, based on the same liturgical formula that we use right now, most of the time, that being the earliest synagogue service that I could find anywhere. There are Christian liturgies and there are Jewish liturgies, but to find one in between those two, that is difficult. Again, that took a lot of research. And when you are reciting these things in the liturgy, you are reciting anointed, sacred, and old ancient words, the same words that Yeshua would have recited when he was speaking in the synagogue there in Nazareth. Remember, they didn't like him. They were going to throw him over. No wonder you get a lot of persecution in your line of religion. But there was no intention to do permanent services at that time, especially since we started. I counted 5 local Hebrew roots groups. They came into being, and they came within no time. However, those were all rabbinical groups, so much like Jewish churches. And one of the big problems we have, and you have, with rabbinical Messianic groups is that they hold that the oral Torah, a bunch of writings from about 200 AD, are on the same level as the Torah, the written Torah, which simply just cannot be. The oral Torah is full of stories and nonsense, gossip. You know what I mean? Because you probably read it. And little practices that are not only encouraged, but are promoted in Messianic Judaism. In 2013, then we disbanded the local group after some of the group members got very upset over one of our teachers providing lessons on the subject, was Jesus married? And was Paul and Jesus in contradiction? Yeah, that broke the group up right there. I mean, nobody said that Jesus was married or that Paul and Jesus were in contradiction. However, that's the way some people took it, and they broke the group in half. That happens all the time. Believers, they seem to multiply by dividing. The leadership of our covering group also capitulated to sin at that time, and we voted ourselves out of their denomination. Again, this is 2013. In addition to those things, I was personally struggling with bereavement, depression, and health concerns. But a member who I think was here today, maybe still here, that is Commander Lee, convinced us to take the group to cyberspace. And so we started a Facebook group after having a website presence clear back since the 90s. We were online as a website, but we had not gone this far with it with social media. Since many areas in the world have no Messianic presence, and because we saw rabbinical Messianic Judaism, their assemblies, as no more authentic to Jesus or truthful than the church, the cyber group decided to host a weekly Shabbat service and festival service online through meeting software of various kinds. We tried several of them, and really, none were ready for prime time until we found Zoom, and that proved to be far superior to the rest. Of course, we didn't try them all, but I could probably, if I thought about it a little bit, I could tell you some of the ones we did, and they were just horrible. And here we are now. Some people on our lists have been on our list for 30 years. A lot of people that were on our list have gone on. So I have a description for you here, what it tells you on the Facebook group that the purpose of the group is, and I want to read that short. The Vero Yahad is a place for academic study. This was put on years ago. Devotion and unity. Unity is a definition of Yahad, which is a Hebrew word, not jihad, but Yahad. We use the word Yahad also to refer to a small group of like-minded individuals who come together in Yahad to worship Yahweh and attempt to study the ancient scriptures objectively, using the scripture itself, biblically related texts, and history. We're especially seeking the living Messiah in both his original historic context and his living force that continues to influence and interact us with our world even in our day. We attempt this using a roundtable open discussion method. Yahadim means united ones and is the plural of Yahad, togetherness, in Hebrew. We learned a little something there. The Netzari, or the Nazarene, or the Nazarenes, represent the first followers of Messiah that we know of. Nazarenes are technically Messianics, but in this group, we prefer to dissociate ourselves with the name Christian or Christianity due to the negative connotations today. As I mentioned, scholars call those people Jewish Christians. And I can't say it upsets me, but it annoys me every time I read that term. It's a new term, but they were neither Jewish nor were they Christians, but they're far more Jewish than they were the other. The Essenes represent the precursors to the Nazarene faith, and to Yeshua. And in this sense, we study the Essenes as a foundation stone of our faith, with Yeshua being the chief cornerstone. Again, I urge you to look through the pamphlet. Jesus was a Qumran Essene. There's a lot to learn in a very short time there. So in the group, we could discuss the liberality, with liberality, the issues of theology, text, ethics, the nuances of those who believe themselves to be followers of this way. We can discuss these things in peace with scholarly brothers and sisters, autodidacts. Here I was criticized for using a big word, and that was the word here recently. The nuances of those who believe themselves to be followers of the way, self-studiers, autodidacts, self-teachers. We can discuss these in peace without fearing to be personally insulted. And we continue here with what is a description on the think tank site. Let us help address your learnings, yearnings, burnings, your questions, mentions, and lections, so that we may all arrive at improved thoughts and understandings regarding our common yet unique faith perspective. And the key word in all this is civility. Civility, a practice which today is nearly dead. So we find in the scrolls that the Manual of Discipline, the Yahad rule, which is their book of the way of doing things, was periodically updated by the Yahad for the following reasons. 2 reasons, very important. 1, because people come and go and come again, and before long, the group is completely new. 2nd, because times and cultures change, and the group leadership and culture must also change insofar as the word of Elohim and the testament of Yeshua permit. Things have got to change. Now, I witnessed this personally because I found 13 copies of their Manual of Discipline, their Yahad rule, among the scrolls. They're all different. They're all written at different times. It was as though one were succeeding the other, which likewise tells me that these people were actively pursuing reorganization periodically in order to keep up with the people and the times. This principle is really worth further discussion, for it's profound. And it can, if followed, ensure the future validity of any religious movement. If you think about it and don't take it at face value, thinking that we want to run off with culture, that's not the case. But culture does change. Everything changes. And after a few years, 5 or 10, you need to relook at what you believe and write your belief down in pencil, and then write them down in eraser if you need to. So the primitives we're talking about, they reevaluated their rules and reorganized when the time to do so became obvious. I repeat this again. Their Manual of Discipline, called the Rule, was periodically updated for the following reasons. because people come and go, and before long, the group is completely new, and because times and cultures change, and the group leadership must also change with the time, insofar as the word of Elohim and the testimony of Yahshua permit. And again, we find in Acts chapter 1, this was practiced in the Jesus movement in the process of replacing Yehuda Iscariot. There were nominations made, and then they had a vote of the members for replacement. Matthias was chosen. Yeshua Barsabas Justus wasn't. We are told that Peter was a chosen leader, but he riled up King Agrippa I, and he had to leave the country or be caught and crucified. That was about 43 AD, not even 10 years after the resurrection. So he left, he went to Rome, which in his letter he called Babylon. I'm convinced he went to Rome. There's just too much writing about Kifa in Rome, and there's none in Asian Babylon that I can find. But I find in several texts, including the Revelation, they use the word Babylon to as an epithet for Rome. And he got out of the frying pan into the fire there. Take a look at the Nazarene Acts, volume 3, and you'll see just how much. There's the career of Peter in Rome, and it's extensive. In his place came Yeshua's brother, Yaakov, for Yeshua demonstrated that his choice for leader was James. That was unusual, too, since we are told that Yaakov, James the Just, wasn't among his first followers. I'm thinking that's in John 7, that James didn't even believe in him. But by the time a leader was needed, James was ready, having already received the ordaining anointing by his brother, Yeshua, whether alive in the flesh or alive in the spirit, I'm not sure, but that is written in at least 2 or 3 sources, that James was ordained for this. And when we get to Acts 15, we find out that James is the head of the assembly. So when James was executed in 62 by the priests and the Pharisees, there was another election in which Shimon the Zealot, or the one known as Shimon bar Cleopas, was chosen to lead the group. Shimon's leadership lasted until his crucifixion at the end of the 1st century. That was another brother or cousin of Yeshua. So the Jerusalem congregation of Yahweh had become a dynasty of a Nazarene family from Nazareth in Galilee. Further, the rule tells us that when the local Yahad would get to 15 members or so, they were to send some of them away to start another group. Actually, to go forth and find people who had already been educated in the faith, to assess them as whether they would be good candidates for a new Yahad or not. It's plain that the apostles did the same thing, as they were sent out with nothing in Matthew 9 or 10 to towns and villages, go on to people they knew, not strangers, for among Essene types, and there were thousands of them, Josephus says at the time, a fellow member had the right to enter another's house and stay there, and even take anything he needed to go. That was their ethic of ownership. Yahshua said something like, "Don't even wear sandals." And I would add to that something, pick up your cousin's sandals when you get there, you can have them. This is what the apostles did when they were sent out, proving to them that they really needed nothing but the good news and its giver. And they healed the sick in the house, just to show the power of their master and to earn their keeps and pay their respects. The openness is also testified to in the apostolic pamphlet called the Didache, which was surely written by James or Shimon, with instructions about visiting and hospitality. It's a small handbook for new believers and for overseers. Just 16 chapters, I think. That's all. And I've, along with all the other ones, I've translated that one in a new non-churchy translation, which is available to you for free. Everyone should read that. That predates even the New Testament, and by decades. So that's called the Didache. It's also called the Teaching of the 12, not the Gospel of the Holy 12, which is a demonic instrument channeled from 3 dead people. So we sent people out to sow a seed, and so did they. A seed to a need of their guests, and that's what we can do. We can sow a seed to a need even daily without going anywhere, for these fellows weren't pushy nor threatening. Knowing what they offered wasn't for everyone. They didn't get upset about it, and especially it was not for those called the men of the pit. Knowing that if these were given access to the Yahad fellowship, they'd cause every trouble they could, as though the devil himself were let into the fellowship, and in fact, he was. The target audience consisted of people who were already well informed. They didn't deal with newbies to religion in the Yahad. They didn't go trying to convince worldly people. They didn't attempt to pester a stranger in the marketplace with a gimmick like, if you died tonight, do you know where you'll be going? They went instead to those of post-Judaism, to only the sons and daughters of Israel, this being not a political title, but a title of those already living within the theocracy of Yahweh and obeying his rules of life, but desiring fellowship with the like-minded. That's who they wanted to discover. And as far as the apostles go, the first place they're going to go is to the people they knew, people that they knew were religious, to gauge where they were in their faith and to decide whether they could introduce this society to them or not. So our target mission isn't to get someone saved, because you can't get anyone saved anyway. Nor can you bring someone to recognize the state of being lost, though they'll pretend sometimes. The Spirit has to convict others, and the Spirit knows the hearts of people. You don't. Yahweh knows that. You don't know that. Our mission and audience are those who are already justified, or as many say, saved, hoping for eventual salvation, and looking for direction and a set-apart society or congregation so they can be part of the miraculous. They've already been through the church. I guess we should call that the ringer, and left. They were put out or cast out, usually because the church hasn't any viable discipline. And sometimes the same people find out about the pagan practices being performed under the guise of worship in a church and have become disgusted. Those are the ones we're looking for. And already we've certainly entertained, listen to me, we have entertained thousands of people in the last 20 years and still are every single day sowing our seeds to their needs. You would be amazed at how many requests I get for advice or books or to tell about a particular passage in the Bible. lots of other things, prayer, counseling. You see, the church has its purpose. We admit the church has its purpose, but the Yahad also has its purpose, and there are not many like us. And these purposes aren't the same, but hopefully the church can instill the tales and myths and some of the books of faith and some of the stories, but they can never disperse the deep things of Yahweh because they don't have them. After that, if the seed falls on good ground, these people become ripe for something more advanced, something with responsibility, something they can be proud of in the master or not. There's no better place to start than where the church leaves off. And where they leave off is primarily at the tales of creation, David and Goliath, the Ten Commandments, Noah's Ark, Jesus meek and mild in the midst of a group of behaving children, Jesus in a manger, Jesus on the cross. These stories are meant for the simple. They're meant for the immature. They can't go past the literal meaning of the story in whatever version they happen to read. We learned them when we were simple and immature and young, before zeal took over our lives. But you and I know there's a world of life missing when we confine our evangelism to elementary stories. And that, after time, the Spirit urges that one foreknown since the foundation of the world to more, go further, do, or eventually despair of your faith. I'm supposing that most who come around, those among the 2,500 followers on Facebook that we have conglomerated in the last 10 years, the 2,600 followers on YouTube just in the last 3 years, the 667 members of the think tank, and the myriads who've received books, materials, calendars, essays, counseling, ordination training, and whatever else we offer, for me, could use our ministries. Every one of them. I'm talking about your ministry as well as mine, and maybe even commit to join our happy band. The information about joining, for your information, is joinyahad.org. That's one word, joinyahad.org. I'll tell you, that website shows up well in a Microsoft browser, but in a Google browser, it does not. And I don't know why that is, but that's something we'll have to work around until we know the difference. You see, a lot of these people we reach are not joiners. I understand that because I'm not a joiner either. I don't join clubs and stuff. They know to join means to make a commitment. People today don't make commitments much. They're not willing to make it. And that's something also to talk about. Yeah, I'm almost done. So what's next for the Yahad and New Earth restoration? From the perspective of what I think I should do is to offer ongoing education each Shabbat to the people here on the subject of the primitive faith, its people, their theological and cultural understanding, so we can eventually, once again, build the foundation based on the rejected cornerstone, his mission, his people, and his forebears. Unless you have listened to my series on YouTube, I think there's 7 or 8 videos in this called What Happened to the Nazarenes. Unless you've listened to that, you just may not have any idea the difference between the church Jesus, the guy in the picture on the church wall, and the authentic Jesus, insofar as we can get him. There's a huge difference between when he was alive and now. He's alive in a different way, but there is so much emphasis put on Jesus in the sky, that people forget he was a man first. And the most tangible teaching that has survived is what he's talking about in the New Testament, and especially the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5. So, and for you, let's offer an opportunity to exercise your leadership gifts, forgetting not times and people. And in this message, I hope to have started the process yet again. We've gone through it maybe 3 times. You've got gifts. You have gifts in directing what we should do by, again, assigning interesting people and interested people to what they do best or what they want to do and empowering them to do it. That's my mission and strength, networking those things. So think about yourself for a moment. Yeah, I'm a little long. I always am. What is your mission and strength? What is your calling? So many people I've asked that question to, and they don't know. Would you share that info with me? Will you take up the yoke with me? Will you volunteer a little bit of time? And will you say, I will, unconditionally, and mean it? Will you join our happy crews and pay your pittance of monthly dues? You know, those who gripe the most seldom pay anything in dues or offerings, even if they have made a vow to do so. Praise Yah that a few are very faithful in giving, because we have some significant expenses, including our Haiti missions, which we have to keep up or we'll have failed in our ministry. Even if we are but a little flock, there's, to me, considerable amount of administrative fees. There's a lot behind those little websites and a lot of expense there. So has Elohim given you the skill of reading? What a surprise to hear Marcel singing today. If it's singing or reading, then sing or read. All right, told that. Okay. The manual tells us, when you get 15, send some away. The master told his followers, take nothing with you. I want to help you, said the rich boy Clement to Barnabas in Rome. Then he said, I'll meet you in Israel as soon as I settle my affairs. And that Clement bought his ticket on a ship that very day to set out soon for a 6-week trip on the sea. Take up the book and read, cried the children playing outside. St. Augustine heard it and wondered why these kids were shouting the slogan. But in an instant, he understood. It's the master speaking to me through those children. And now, being the opportune time near to the master's visitation, soon coming Messiah, what I hear is, take up the book and do it. Like the teacher of righteousness, like his intentions in the medication this morning, like Joshua, Yaakov, Kepha, Clement, and the lost apostles, like Ariston, we've never heard of. Walk through that door and say yes. And our message and good works will ring forth into the future, just as theirs have.